was gonna try and film this in daylight, but that didn't end up happening, so we're just gonna be super atmospheric in here. I'm lighting this with candles. I'm not putting the overhead light on. What do I look, stupid? So much of the shit on my bed is visible. Oh my god. Ignore the clothes pile up there. I'm not dealing with that right now. 2025 was, there were 365 days in it, and it started and it ended. There was one of each of the months. That's about all I have to say about that. But I felt all year that I was reading less than normal, that I was being pulled in too many directions, that I wasn't meeting quotas and, you know, getting my numbers up. I just got my Goodreads end of year wrapped, and this has been technically my best reading year ever. I'm editing. Only I would make a video with this premise and forget to say the number. I read 111 books in 2025. There are some caveats with that. I read a lot of comics, many of which were sort of one and done, sit there for an hour and then I've read it. A lot of books that aren't super long. There is one book in this lineup that I am reluctant to call a book because it was about 20 pages and each of the pages was a single illustration, but fuck it. My main criteria for what counts as a book is whether I can log it on Goodreads. I wish I wasn't so tied to Goodreads, but the story graph is so confusing to me, it's just impenetrable. Yeah, I was so sure that I'd read more in, say, 2023, but in 2023 I reached 91, and I read all 4 Heartstoppers that year. I was reading a lot of comics for my degree as well, because I did graphic design with a focus on comics and illustration, so a lot of the stuff early in the year is just comic after comic after comic. Just to preface, because it is the discourse every year when everybody's doing their end of year wrap-ups, I have never hit that number before, and the reason I've hit that number this year is because I'm reading so many comics. These metrics are meaningless and stupid, and definitely this year I've been trying to shift my focus from getting through as much stuff as possible towards making sure I'm getting as much out of stuff as possible. Ironic that I was genuinely, that was like the only thing that I said last year that could constitute a reading goal, and I've managed to hit the biggest number I've ever hit. But I've also been trying to pledge to worry less about whether something counts as reading. Who gives a fuck? Who gives a fuck? So, without further ado, let us begin. Book number 1, Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White. Batshit crazy in the best way possible. Not my favourite of his. I think Andrew Joseph White suits fantasy a lot more because the suspension of disbelief makes room for the melodrama, but I still really enjoyed it. Passion of the Rabbit God by Hongwei Bao. I liked this collection a lot. I thought it was very sweet, very emotional. Not one of my favourite collections of the year, but it made me like Hongwei Bao hugely as a person. I could see him through the writing and I liked what I saw. Celebration by Damir Karakaš. The prose was quite opaque. Worth the read, but foggy in my mind. I have certain images, one of this man kind of tying himself up into a tree, that are very vivid in my mind. As an overall plot, I don't recall a huge amount. Things I Don't Want to Know by Deborah Levy. I do get the Deborah Levy hype. One of those authors who just has the ability to look at a scenario and pick out the perfect nugget of literary wording to crack the whole thing open. Oh, the Binky Brown sampler by Justin Green. I can't believe I read that this year. It has had so much impact on the way I look at comics, on the way I think about comics. This genuinely changed my life. I thought it was incredible. I thought it was an unbelievably enlightening, insightful, and intelligent depiction of OCD, and he didn't get diagnosed with OCD after he wrote this comic for another 20 years. Is it perfect? Far from it. But for the time it was written and released, the radical depiction of mental health that is radical to this day in here, I can only hold it in the highest regard. Girlmode by Magdalene Visaggio. This left a lot to be desired. I quite admire this comic for what it does for the genre. It's like a trashy chick flick about a trans girl who's just moved to a new school. It's fun as a piece of kind of trash fiction, and I mean that in the kindest way possible because I love a bit of trash, but Was this a good depiction of trans existence? Was this a good comic to be giving to teenagers? I don't think so. Underground Classics, The Transformation of Comics into Comics by James P. Danky and Dennis Kitchen. Danky and Kitchen, those guys aren't real. I thought this was good as a sampler on the comics world, and they did an okay job at finding more diverse comics creators from the 60s and 70s to include in the collection, considering how white the movement was. The essays that were included on the comics movement were sorely lacking in the way they approached the disastrous lack of diversity in the movement. Most of the essayists, except Trina Robbins, who I think is the only female contributor to the essays at the beginning of this collection, act as if it was a utopic movement, and then Trina Robbins was like, it was so difficult to be a woman in the comics movement, and I think there should have been more focus on a balanced depiction of the movement as opposed to it being a purely revolutionary thing. Above Us the Sea by Ania Card. The start of this book was incredible. The end of it was quite good. The middle, what the fuck was that? I just did not like it at all. Too long. Give me the first 100 pages of the book for another 200 pages and it would have been a 5-star. The Sweeter Side by Robert Crumb. There wasn't a huge amount I had to say about this. It was just a compilation of his less offensive comics, and it was alright. He's an incredibly talented artist, and I will always have a soft spot for Robert Crumb because he was so loud about being a degenerate. The blurb says something about this being his publisher's efforts to make him appeal more to women, which I think is hilarious. Enlightened Transsexual Comics by Sam Szabo. I love Sam Szabo. It might be Szabo. I should probably Google it. I thought this collection was incredible. This is exactly what I want out of modern comics with an X. Edgy, fun, unapologetic. Love, 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 love. Will recommend forever. Boy Island by Leo Fox. Oh! No notes. Unbelievable, incredible, beautiful illustrations. 5 stars times 5. The Chromatic Fantasy by H.A. Kill me fucking dead. Shoot me right here, right now. Visually stunning. I weep for everybody in the world who will never get to see a physical version of this comic in real life. It is so decadent, so beautiful. The contents are so fun and ridiculous and emotionally compelling. I love this. One of my faves of the year. Girl in the World by Caroline Cash. I love Caroline Cash. I thought this was a really cute comic. I think it doesn't have quite the strength of some of her other stuff, but I don't think it was intending to. It's just a bunch of girls getting together, just meeting up in various states of transit, and you watch them all navigating life around each other for a little bit. Short, sweet, lovely to look at. PeePeePooPoo #1 by Caroline Cash. This is more what I like from Caroline Cash. Little bits and pieces here and there, different styles to accommodate different short stories and comic strips. Made me want to be a newspaper comic artist in an age in which that as a genre has been completely nullified. When to Pick a Pomegranate by Yasmeen Abedifard. I love this kind of collage style. I love this kind of strange, disjointed, esoteric storytelling that conveys a sense rather than a cohesive narrative. No notes, beautiful, would recommend. Stuck Rubber Baby by Howard Cruse. Now, I loved this when I read it because I thought it was an autobiographical comic. It's like autofiction, and I don't quite know how to feel about it because I'm not as sure how much of the events of this book actually happened and how much of it Howard Cruse personally experienced. Only because I thought this was going to be a comic about being a gay man, and it was actually more about the Black civil rights movement of the US, and Howard Cruse is a white guy, and it's told through the lens of him not really actually being personally invested in the Black civil rights movement, but being adjacent to it and participating in rallies because his girlfriend was. If it was autobiographical, and that might be an autobiographical element of the story, it would be a really powerful recognition of his own privilege, but I don't know how truthful it is, so I don't know how well to rate it. I think it's worth a read, but I don't know, held up to the standards of today, that this would have an entirely clean slate. I really like the art style. A lot of people don't like the art style of this comic at all. I love it. Sunday by Olivier Schrauwen. Now, this was one that I thought was so pretentious in its scale that I was determined to hate it. So it is a testament that I never have stopped thinking about this comic and the ingenious way that it tells its story. Really enjoyed it. Beautiful to look at. Liquid, a love story by Mariam Rahmani. It's one of those books that to read on the page I found quite frustrating, but it's so vivid in my mind. I thought this was very intelligent, so fun, despite how absolutely dire most of the book is. At times very moving. I loved the 2 or 3 sort of tone shifts and switches. I loved the ending. Crawl Space by Jessie Jacobs. I liked this a lot. It follows a little girl who can climb into the washing machine and enter a fantastical reality made of fractal creatures. But when she tries to introduce her friends to this world, it doesn't go entirely to plan and things kind of fall apart. Short, sweet, the star of the show here are these fractal illustrations. Jessie Jacobs is fucking crazy, and I want to read 18 more of it. The Lamb by Lucy Rose. I liked this story, a beautiful illustration of the way a parent-child relationship can become internally cannibalistic. I don't know that I got a lot out of reading it, but I thought it was good. Holy Lacrimony by Michael DeForge. I'm chronically obsessed with Michael DeForge. I love that guy. I loved the parts of this comic that was set in space, the exploration of sadness and this alien race that can't experience sadness themselves, so they pick who they perceive to be the saddest person on Earth to learn sadness from, almost as a theatre art. I thought that was incredible. The parts that followed, where the protagonist is back on Earth, I found less compelling, but I still overall really liked this, and Michael DeForge is like an all-timer for me. Les Normeaux by Janine Jansen. Fuck, I don't know. Les Normeaux. Is it slop? Yeah. Would I recommend it? Not necessarily, but I had fun with it. Leaving Richard's Valley by Michael DeForge. I thought the scale of it was really fun. I love his format of writing a webcomic and then turning it into a longer form thing, because it allows the story to go on 4-panel tangents all the time. You see a little bit of this world, a little bit of that world. I really, really liked this comic. I thought it was super fun. Ghost World by Daniel Close. Here I was, everybody telling me that this comic was incredible. I borrowed a Ghost World compendium from my school library. I thought it was a big comic. I thought it was a collection of comics. It's like 80 pages max, and then the rest of this 400-page fucking book. 400 might be an exaggeration, but in a book that thick, the actual comic was that much, and then the rest of it was essays, none of which I could bring myself to read after the disappointment of the comic itself. It came across that Daniel Close had never spoken to a teenage girl in his life. Frontier number 10 by Michael DeForge. This is the one on this list that I am reluctant to call a book, because it was like a little sampler of Michael DeForge's work, but I liked it a lot. How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell. I love this book. I think I'm in a prime position to receive Jenny Odell's writing because she's an art lecturer and writes about stuff through that academic lens, which I've been primed to read because I went to art school. So I really, really liked this. I know a lot of people think it's pretentious or privileged. I don't see that, but I see how her writing can be unapproachable. So I get the critiques of this book, but I really, really, really liked it and think it's very important. Birds of Maine by Michael DeForge. This might be my favourite Michael DeForge comic. I am obsessed with Birds of Maine. The landscape he depicts here could not be more ludicrous or alien, and yet the story is so human. His characters are so charmingly flawed. It's a coming-of-age story told from the perspective of a bird who lives on Mars. And he does it so well, it's so good. Another of those webcomic format adaptations where he's drawn 4 panels at a time and then compiled them into one long story, which works so well for me. A Guest in the House by E.M. Carroll. I thought the illustration and the paneling in this comic were the incredible standout features of this one. I thought the story was pretty fun. But it really took a backseat to the incredible high colour panels. That's the main thing I took away from this one. Maybe that's a disservice to E.M. Carroll. Stuff, Compulsive Hoarding and the Meaning of Things by Randy O. Frost. This is not really a book you can rate. I read it for my dissertation. It was harrowing and enlightening, and I would encourage anybody who has had family members who hoard or perhaps is at risk of developing hoarding tendencies themselves to read this book, because it will scare the fuck out of you. A Fix of Light by Kel Menton. I'm not really the target audience for this kind of book anymore. It's a YA queer novel, but transmasculine character, talks about mental health and struggling without flinching or pulling punches, which I think is really important. I think a lot of kids' literature underestimates the maturity and capacity of people. Yeah, I thought this one was pretty good. Not anything I would personally write home about, but I'm just not in that demographic anymore. It is what it is. I would recommend it to younger readers. Why Fish Don't Exist: A Story of Love, Loss, and the Hidden Orders of Life by Lulu Miller. There were parts of this book I loved. I really, really liked this like in-depth exploration of a historical figure from both positive and negative angles, and I really like media that does that while sort of telling a parallel biography of the author. I'm obsessed with this Mountain Goats podcast where the podcaster explains what John Darnielle was doing for every year of the podcaster's life. I really like that kind of parallel storytelling, so I was like primed to really receive this book well. Lulu Miller's writing is just relentlessly floral. She called her long-term partner curly hair or brown eyes or something like that. Instead of giving them monikers that allow you to read the book seamlessly, it's like, oh, Teddy Bear was doing this, Glasses Freckles did this, and it's a little bit kitschy. The taxonomist that this book is about, it turns out, was a huge proponent of eugenics, and that is used as like a twist in the middle of the book, is the point where she's like, surprise, he was one of the biggest eugenicists in the big eugenicist movement. Jump scare! And she tandem storytells that alongside like her cheating on her loving partner. A lot of mixed feelings about this one, but I did enjoy some of it, and I liked the takeaway at the end of the book. I just don't know how much I would like Lulu Miller if I met her, you know? That was a long one. Okay. Ordinary Saints by Niamh Nieuw-Lowen. I read this book twice this year. It's unbelievable. It's so good. Unparalleled. I want to crawl into Niamh Nieuw-Lowen's skin. I want to live there. I think she is incredible. Astrea by Kate Crewemink got to me in a way I wasn't expecting. I got about 3/4 of the way through the book, and then the full weight of it hit me at once, and I ended up really taking a lot away from it. It's told from the perspective of a girl who has, due to like a traumatic past, completely severed her memory of anything from before she boarded this prison ship that is going to Australia. As a result, the ship itself feels like this horrible, isolated colony in and of itself. It feels like they're on an island in the middle of space. Really something. Influencer by Jade LFT Peters. I really liked this. I love the art style of this one. Cute, lovely. I really like the idea of mundanity and sort of homemaking in the face of the apocalypse. I think that as a genre is a really lovely parallel to like the current state of affairs. I don't know. A Room Above a Shop by Anthony Shapland. This won Waterstone's Welsh Book of the Year, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's the kind of very, very dense purple prose that would be really exhausting if this book wasn't like 100 pages long and this big. Tender, mundane, makes the ordinary extraordinary in the best way possible. Fathers and Fugitives by S.J. Norday. This is one of the most curiously miserable books I have ever read. Every new section of this book was just more and more horrendous. I loved the first story because of the deeply unsettling feeling it left me with. Someone who is so detached from any sort of positive emotion that he'll just do anything for a shred of human connection that is so transparently false and with pretense. I became obsessed with this character's psychology after the first chapter of the book, and it's presented as short stories, and then the rest of them just didn't hold that same edge. I finished this book feeling like I'd licked a toilet seat. Universality by Natasha Brown. I thought this book was very, very good. I think Natasha Brown is incredibly intelligent, and it was so painfully British in its performance of politeness between the characters. The depiction of like the way media rackets work and the way everything beyond a certain level in societal structures is for the purpose of status and image. Did I enjoy reading it? Not particularly. Do I think it is excellent? Yes. Orlando by Virginia Woolf. What is there to say about Orlando by Virginia Woolf? 5 stars. Kirby's Lessons for Falling in Love by Laura Gao. I was not a huge fan of this one. I like loose art styles a lot, but the extent to the sketchiness of this one. I think that really works when you can tell the artist has an incredible grasp of like human form. I'm not saying that Laura Gao doesn't have that, but that these come across more like first drafts than deliberately sketchy drawings. If the story was okay, but the pacing was a little bit off, it ebbed and flowed. That's not to say it's not worthwhile. I think somebody who could perhaps relate to the situation that this character is in more would get a huge amount out of this, especially younger readers, and this is a YA comic, so. They Bloom at Night by Trang Tan Tran. Is it the best book in the world? Not necessarily. I think the storytelling is a little bit idealistic and melodramatic. I'm pretty sure this is also a YA book, so I have a lot of time for that kind of storytelling, because you're speaking to like a younger audience, you're expressing emotion in a way that is not going to be as over-intellectualized as it may be in a piece of adult fiction. I loved the visuals of this. I loved the body horror elements. I was fascinated by the transformation that the protagonist is to be going through for this book, and I thought the world building was fantastic. I was just so engrossed in this swampland that these characters inhabit. Dengue Boy by Mikhail Nieva. I wanted this book to be so much better than I ended up finding it. The premise is so good, but I think a lot of it ended up going down a kind of gross out route. And not necessarily that it was bad, just that it went down routes that didn't quite work for me. And what I was fascinated by and was not expecting, and then was very disappointed at the underdevelopment of, Dengue Boy, who is a mosquito boy, he's like a half human, half mosquito, just randomly transitions and becomes Dengue Girl. I wanted to know so much more about that. I thought that would have been such an interesting thing to elaborate on, and when I got to that part of the book I thought, whoa, this is about to get so good. It doesn't really go anywhere in a way that felt meaningful to me. I was just looking for more than it had to offer me, particularly. The Coin by Yasmeen Zahar. Now, I think I gave this a 3-star at the time. I think just reflecting on it now, it feels like more like a 4 to 4.5. Miserable to read, and that is precisely the point. This character is eternally unhappy in a way that is so difficult to face. It's an ingeniously written book. I loved the fourth wall breaks, which I wasn't expecting at all, where the narrator just randomly addresses the reader, and I think that has a real risk of falling flat. But for me, it felt like for a brief moment, the narrator, who, as far as we're concerned, is speaking into thin air, suddenly looks straight into the camera. And I felt pinned to my seat when I read that. The rest of it, again, miserable to read, and you want her to go into so much more detail about the things that are troubling her, but that is precisely the point, is that she's masking that with a veneer of class and acceptability. She's preoccupied with the pursuit of beauty and the pursuit of glamour, and she refuses to address her own unhappiness and the roots of it. And that's precisely the point. We as the reader never get full insight into that. We get glimmers. And if you're willing to read into it in that way, you can absolutely make inferences about what is actually happening in this book. The main character is looking stubbornly to the side of the actual plot, which is so interesting to read and really fantastically done. And I loved the ending of this book, but it was difficult to read. So my rating on this fluctuates depending on how recently I read it. Cosplayers by Dash Shaw. Dash Shaw will forever hold a special place in my heart. I think this comic was kind of lame. I thought it was fun, but it didn't do much. Yeah, I thought it was fun, but it didn't do much. Love in Exile by Sean Fay. Series Shoot Me 17 Times in the Head. World Map Room by Yuichi Yokoyama. This opened the floodgates on me to reading Yuichi Yokoyama, who I think is incredible. The most nuts shit, the most insane storyteller. You read interviews with this guy and he acts like he's doing nothing out of the ordinary, and then you read his comics and you're like, what planet are you from? I love Yuichi Yokoyama. I thought World Map Room was incredible, unbelievably tense, unbelievably strange, made me feel a little bit nauseous, and I can't enunciate why. Outdoors by Yuichi Yokoyama. This is probably my favorite Yokoyama. I don't think it is his best comic, but it just really appeals to me in particular. It is all about these alien entities navigating the world, or characters who we perceive as alien because they're so far detached from a recognizable human form, I guess. Oh, not human form, but human face. They have human bodies and like heads made of shapes. But they get into these little pods just to listen to rain fall. They go into a field and they approach these hay bales and agricultural structures, except doors open from random parts on these structures, and they climb in and they turn out to be cabins constructed for the purpose of different methods of observing rain. Each cabin is shaped in a certain way that the rain falls in a different way and makes a different sound, and you go from cabin to cabin and see how Yuichi Yokoyama illustrates the pattern of the rainfall and the sound it makes. Absolute cinema! Everything that I'm weird about in a comic in the best way possible. The Gull Yetin by Joe Kessler. Joe Kessler, if you're reading this, please! I don't know what I'm begging for, but please! Please republish Windowpane so I can own a copy. I need to return the copy I have to a library. I probably owe so much in fines. Speaking of Windowpane by Joe Kessler. I love this comic. It's realistically a 5-star, but in order to differentiate it from the Gull Yetin, which is one of my favorites ever, I gave it kind of a 4.5, but they're both so incredible. The Gull Yetin is my favorite of the two, and it is one of my favorite reads of the year. So vibrant, so ludicrous, so... one of those comics that, through abstraction, creates a story that is all the more human because of how detached it is from known reality. Colony by Annika Norlin. I really like this premise. I wasn't sure if it was going to be what I wanted it to be, and then it turned out to be so much more than what I wanted it to be. A story about a group of people living in a colony that starts out with this what are these freaks doing kind of midsummer atmosphere, and then resolves into a profoundly human story about people trying to live in a new way. Milk White Steed by Michael Kennedy, my comic of the year. I fucking love this. Michael D. Kennedy. I don't even know what there is to say. There's a short story in this that is called, I think, Duke Ellington Goes to Mars, and it's just a series of drawings of Duke Ellington looking miserable on Mars. This collection ranges from the everyday to the abstract on a page-by-page basis. The illustration style is incredible. I want every page on my walls as a poster. I really don't think there's anything quite like this that exists. I think Michael D. Kennedy is doing something very new, and it's so exciting. Sympathy Tower Tokyo by Rie, I want to say Kudan. This ended up being quite a large release this year, at least I've seen a lot of copies in shops in the UK. I had very mixed feelings about this because I liked the way it was written a lot. It was very easy to get into, it was tackling some very interesting topics, but the tower as an entity, this prison tower, it's supposed to be tackling what I perceive it to be attempting to approach the idea of prison reform and the way people are going to react to it. But then we don't actually hear about the ethos of this prison tower. They talk all the time about, I don't know, the ethics of allowing violent and harmful criminals the freedom that a reformative prison offers. But then when we actually see the tower constructed, we're never given clarity as to whether there are actually violent criminals living in this building. The only people we hear about living in this tower are people who stole and people who committed, like, fraud. Are there violent criminals in this institution or not? Because that, for me, makes or breaks the book and the concept and the discussion being had. Coterie by Lucia Leitmeyer. This is a tandem storytelling tale where one character is living in the 1700s and one is in the present day in, I want to say, Barcelona. I really, really liked the modern parts, the way this character explores her own self-worth through the lens of relationships and the way her entire sense of self is disrupted. And I thought the way that was paralleled with the story from history was really important and impressive and well done. I loved also the resolution. I had no spoilers, but I loved the way she resolves, the woman from the present, resolves her unresolved emotion towards her ex. I thought that resolution was so funny and so fun and so well done. The epilogue of this book pissed me off so bad that it knocked a whole star off the rating. Actually pissed me off. Actually upset me. Because why did I read the rest of the book if you're gonna do some stupid shit at the end? Gunk by Saba Sams. I had very, very mixed feelings about this book. I loved the way it was written. I loved the characters. Well, no, I didn't love the characters, but I loved the way that the main character Jules' internal monologue was explored. I thought she was a very interesting character, but I thought the relationship and the way it was portrayed in this book between her and the younger character, Nim, I want to say. I thought the way their relationship unfolded and was explored was really, really weird. It says on the blurb of the book, at least the copy that I have, that Nim is 19. And in the actual text of the book, she is described as freshly 18, not long 18. And she's pregnant and she's living in a horrible, like, decrepit flat. She's working in a nightclub. Jules imprints on this poor woman. Jules is now in her late 20s, early 30s, I want to say. I can't remember exactly what her age is. She's significantly older and more stable, and the way that it is never addressed as something that might be unhealthy, really, kind of disturbed me. I was reading it and the way Jules described Nim. I've not seen in any discussions about this book the nature of their age gap and the fact that Nim is barely an adult and she's in a position of exceptional dependence. I have so many feelings about this book and I feel like nobody else is talking about this, and really, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to rate this book. I don't know how I feel about it. If the intention of the book was to write a story from the perspective of someone who is borderline grooming a younger person, fully believing themselves to be blameless, it's an incredible feat of literature. Otherwise, I don't know. Bring the House Down by Charlotte Runcie. I read this book because I was going to the Edinburgh Fringe at the end of August. This book takes place during the Edinburgh Fringe, and I thought it would be fun, and it was. I can't really speak to how the book approaches the wrong that is done by one of the main characters of this book, because the whole story is about the unfolding of a media scandal about this journalist at probably The Guardian, who is outed by one of the performers at the Fringe for writing her a terrible review and then sleeping with her without telling her that he was the person that wrote this horrible review. She then completely changes the content of her show to be about Alex, the journalist, and the wrongs that he's done her. And when the clips of this performance go viral, more women from his past, they phone in to talk about what he's done to them. The thing that I found issue with is that the protagonist of the book feels that she knows Alex well enough to kind of stand by him to an extent, even when he's getting outed for worse and worse stuff throughout the book. And I understand that there's a conflict between the person you know and the person being portrayed, and I thought that would be an interesting thing to explore in the book, except that Alex never really faces a real consequence. Spoilers for the book, he doesn't end up losing his job. I mean, he loses his position initially, but he's kept on at the newspaper. Regardless of the morality of it, it is incredibly unprofessional and surely like a terrible look for the newspaper, for its journalists to be sleeping with the people they write bad reviews about. That's just a bad, like, I don't think it would be outrageous for him to lose his job, like, for that, but it's kind of portrayed as like, oh, cancel culture's gone crazy, they want Alex fired, like, yeah. He ends up getting demoted with the idea in mind that eventually he'll work his way back up. It's like, no, just get rid of the guy. Am I the friend that's too woke? I don't know. Spent by Alison Bechdel. This is another incredible piece of autofiction. I think Alison Bechdel speaks so profoundly and with such humor about the ludicrousness of living in the current moment and the hopelessness of it, and the way it's very, very easy to get mired in feelings of hopelessness when the only thing that we can do in this moment right now is act, is to do stuff, is to fight back. It's so silly, so uncompromising in its queerness. Sunstruck by William Rayford Hunter. I really want to champion this book. I think William Rayford Hunter has a lot of promise. The first half was such a slog because it's all about this character. He's black and gay and from a working class background, and he gets kind of adopted into this very wealthy white family. He ends up in a relationship with the son of this family. They try to make it make sense that the protagonist, the speaker, gets obsessed with Felix, this guy, and they try to make him look like a sympathetic character who's really nice, and he's just not. He's just horrible from the get-go, and the whole way through you're just kind of like, why the fuck are you wasting so much time with this awful, awful man? The latter half of the book and the direction it takes once they have moved to London and the reality of their differences becomes too vast to ignore. Plot-wise was incredible. I'm not 100% sold on William Rayford Hunter's writing style, but I didn't hate it. And I thought it had an interesting story to tell. I just wish the ratio of part 1 to part 2 had been way more in favor of part 2. Kickflip Volume 1 by L.D. Lipinski. I really liked this. Is it slop? Yes. Is it lovely? Yes. I think we need so many more stories about queer teenagers, aimed at queer teenagers, where nothing terrible happens. I think Heartstopper isn't like the best comic in the world. No, it's corny as fuck, but it fills a very important niche. And when I work in the bookshop and I sell it to younger readers, I'm excited for them to read it, but I think the heavy direction it goes down later in the series makes it a little bit difficult to recommend. You never know what someone else might be going through and you don't want to give them something that might be triggering. Kickflip is now where I go. Confessions by Catherine Airy. I fear that this was a very popular release this year, and I don't get it. I really don't. I thought it was going to be about 9/11, and I was quite interested to see how that would be portrayed in literature, because I've not really read a book where 9/11 is a significant element of the story. And in this book, it really isn't. It's barely it's barely relevant at all. The first chapter, where Cora is in New York as the plane hits the towers, was really incredible. I was so gripped by the first 20-30 pages of the book, and then it becomes a country house drama set in the 80s. Who gives a fuck? Sorry. And then the rest of the book was just this unbelievable slog that never ended. It's like 400 plus pages. I had to switch to the audiobook because it was so dismal. Fitting Indian by Jyoti Chand. This is so obviously not written for me that I feel very strange rating it. I'm not the authority to say whether this is going to be a useful or enlightening book for anybody, but I thought it was, you know, an interesting, important story to tell. I wish the process of healing within the family unit had been explored more later on down the line, because the issues this family go through are incredibly serious. The recovery is a little bit overnight, but at the same time, it's a very highly illustrated and fully colored comic. I'm always wary of saying, I wish there'd been more elaboration on this, because that takes so much planning. So I'm always wary of saying, I wish it had been longer with comics, as like a genuine critique rather than an encouragement. I wish there had been more elaboration, but I didn't dislike it. There's not much I feel I have the authority to say. Travel by Yuichi Yokoyama. I said Outdoors was my favorite by Yuichi Yokoyama earlier. This might tie. I literally don't know how he creates such an intense sense of unease and paranoia in me when there's no text in these whatsoever. There's just something both warm and charming and uncanny about Yuichi Yokoyama's visual storytelling that I cannot get enough of. Buff Soul by Moa Romanova. The art style grew on me, though the way it's drawn initially really confused me, because I kept thinking that the mouths were the noses and the chins were the mouths, because they all have tiny little double chins on their faces. I had to go back a lot to work out what expression each of the characters was trying to portray. The story is honest almost to a fault, gritty, fun in moments, incredibly sort of tender, and you get a sudden insight into why these characters are behaving in the way that they're behaving. It's very sobering and enlightening and beautiful. I did overall really enjoy this. It just wasn't one of my standouts for the year. Garden by Yuichi Yokoyama. This book is fucking crazy. What a guy. There's not much to say about this that I haven't already said about Yuichi Yokoyama's other comics. I just think he's amazing. Ordinary Saints, again. Neve Lowen, I love you! Saraswati by Gunik Johal. I struggled reading this book because the scope of it is crazy. It's just ludicrously big. It's a worldwide novel. It follows about 7 different protagonists across 5 different fucking continents. So much going on in here. So densely packed, so full of life. The process of reading it was quite taxing. I liked the prose style, but it was just so long. You have to get invested in so many different characters, and just when you start to have a sense of them, we switch to a completely different narrative, and we don't really come back to them at any point. Not in a big enough way. The first chapter of this book especially, I have not shut up about since I read it. Just the most incredible, poignant, insightful, piercing depiction of the way people we consider to be like perfectly sound of mind, normal, maybe a little bit head in the clouds men can get swept up into alt-right fascist movements just by the sheer power of their ignorance. The human need to feel community is so great that we overlook glaring red flags until it's almost too late. It's not even a collection, but it reads a bit like a short story collection for how many almost isolated stories there are across so many different areas of the world. So it feels like I'm talking about the first part as a short story, and if it was published as a standalone short story, it would be an easy 5 stars. The rest of the book brings it down to more like a 3.5 to 4. This is why I find rating books such a mixed bag, because there are parts of this book that I want everybody to read, and parts of it that I'm kind of bummed I spent so long reading. I think his power is in a microcosm rather than the worldwide stage that this book tackles, but also I think this concept is so big and so grand that you would need a much bigger page count to fully do it justice, and that sounds ridiculous because this book is already like 400 plus, but this is like a war and peace sort of novel. We're going across like hundreds of years of history and the fractal splitting of a family. The way the family like separates and converges again was really interesting, and I wanted that to be done justice, and I just don't think there was enough elaboration. Which is again crazy to say about such a long book, at least for me. I don't read a lot of long books. But then again, it's a debut. How on earth would he have swung that with publishers? I have a lot of respect and admiration for what Gurnik Yohal is attempting and partially realizing in this book. It didn't quite make the mark for me, but it has made me intensely interested in him as a person and in his writing, and elements of this book were fantastic. Stag Dance by Tori Peters. Holy fuck. Holy fuck. I actually don't know what else to say. Holy fuck. A Field Guide to Getting Lost by Rebecca Solnit. The first few essays in this collection were incredible and beautiful and insightful and really, really interesting. The middle drags. The last essay, maybe the last 2, pulled it back so that I was glad I stuck with it, but I almost didn't. What Awaits Them by Liam Cobb. I picked this up because I looked at the illustration style in a couple of sample pages and I thought, that looks so much like Joe Kessler, and then I found out it's published by Breakdown Press, which is Joe Kessler's publishing house. This is like Joe Kessler, but without as much of the comedy. Oh my god, this is so bleak. So many of these stories are so miserable. This is like a collection of short comics. Many of the illustrations are absolutely stunning. One of the saddest in the collection, but the story in which 2 men are on a horse trek. I think about those illustrations all the time, just so striking. But still, my favorite story by far was the one about the Michelin Man, in which the Michelin Man is not a guy in a costume, he just looks like that, and he puts on glasses with a fake nose attached to go to restaurants and to rate them. This was a mixed bag, but an incredible piece of art, and in places blindingly funny, mostly incredibly sad, incredibly depressing. A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. Intent and ethos are conveyed so well, concise to the point. You get a perfect read of this character. I believe it's pretty autobiographical on the part of Christopher Isherwood, and I know he was an interesting and not particularly morally sound character a lot of the time. Certainly by modern standards, he'd probably be considered a bit of a sleazebag. But I really enjoyed this book. Daybreak, Volume 1 by Moosop. This is a compilation of a webcomic that was published on Wattpad Webtoons, which I did not even know was a thing. I'll be real, I'm out of the loop on that one. I got a copy of this on NetGalley, and every single page had Wattpad Studios printed across it, which drove me wild. Is this slop? Yeah, it sucks, but I like it. Forest Euphoria, The Abounding Queerness of Nature. I love this. I really like it. I listened to an audiobook of this. It enunciates so much about my strange draw to things that are considered gross. I was a snail kid. I was super into snails, super into frogs and slugs and slimy stuff. Patricia Ononiwu-Kai-shan talks often about the affinity that they have felt towards things considered gross and the way they feel that is intrinsically related to their queerness, and it just lit my brain up. I thought, wow, I never thought about it like that, but I loved that read of affection and affinity for like the less desirable parts of nature, because to be queer in the way that I and this author are queer is to live perpetually in the margin. Nocturnos by Laura Perez. The illustrations in this are incredible. I will say that. I have no notes on the art. I polished and executed incredibly, but it might be a translation issue. A lot of the text that went along with the comics just didn't really hit in the way I think the intention was. There were panels that were very dimly lit landscapes to illustrate an emptiness and a darkness. But then there's writing all the way through that was like, it is dark. It is so dark. Everything is dark. And I think the beauty of the comics medium is that you don't need to write it out like that. The illustrations, especially here, are more than enough to illustrate that sense without having to over-explain to the reader. The intrusion of the white text on the dark page nullifies the effect of the imagery. I wish the author had more faith in the reader that what their drawings were trying to convey was being received. Vanishing World by Sayaka Murata. What the fuck was that? Since I read this book and was thoroughly horrified and baffled and dismayed that someone who had written things that I think are incredible had regressed in her approach to the world and her approach to the topics that she's interested in that are done so much better in her own writing elsewhere. And then I found out that rather than this being new writing from Sayaka Murata, this was an earlier novel that is only just now being published in the UK. That makes me feel a lot better about my feelings towards Sayaka Murata, because I was worried. Her other books are so interesting in the way they approach gender and intimacy and sexuality, and this feels like such a step back. I read Vanishing World and I thought, it feels like Sayaka Murata has no idea how she feels about any of these things, and that this book is a process of trying to understand through writing from a different perspective how she herself feels about sex and intimacy. I think that's great as a writing exercise, but to publish it with no tangible or legible conclusion in the text really, really confused me. The ending of this book comes completely out of nowhere, and it was so out of left field that I felt robbed. Wolf in White Van by John Darnielle. I need to read this book again. I was utterly infatuated with this book in the worst way possible, and I mean that in the best way possible. I was hideously fascinated with this character and his psychology and the ways in which his life unfolded, the decisions he made that are just despicable in so many ways, on so many levels, the way he feels about parasociality, the responsibility he feels, or the lack of responsibility he feels for his own life and the lives of others. I love this book for how disenfranchised with the world it made me feel. This is Caliban by Rachel Ingalls. I think this book gets dangerously close to writing a really great parody of romance literature, in that her life is totally transformed by a strange muscular frogman who is very polite and does the dishes. Her engaging in a relationship with this very strange entity whose customs and conventions and emotionality she doesn't understand at all. And then the second half of the book just evolves into this weird soap opera drama that I felt kind of did the start of the book a disservice. Sea of Poppies by Amitav Ghosh. This is a huge novel, and it's the first in a trilogy, which I didn't know when I bought it. I don't know that I intend to read the other two in the series, but the richness of the world that is being drawn here is second to none. Also, the first time I've ever seen Benares written in anything, and that is my name. Not my usual read at all, but very worthy and a star of its genre, for sure. Not the kind of thing I don't know that having read it I would necessarily pick up more like it, but I'm glad I did. Internet Crusader by George Wylesall. This is so fucking fun. What a ludicrous comic. What a fascinating art style. I really thought it was going to be difficult to pass for me, but when you get into George Wylesall's illustration style, at least for me, it really worked once I adjusted to it. The way this is told is almost entirely through AOL chat and Windows 98, like, text boxes and websites and old HTML sites from like the early 2000s. I thought this was so fucking fun. This is a really, really good comic. Not Waving But Drowning and Other Poems by Stevie Smith. It is good. I like it. It makes me want to read more Stevie Smith, but I think the nature of this incredibly slim, condensed volume, it feels like a little bite of something rather than sinking your teeth into a poet's full body of work. So it left me wanting, but I think that's the point. The Epic of Kader Idris, I really, really like this collection. I think it's so vibrant. This approach to writing is so beautiful. The playlist included by the author did a lot for me. I really like it. I still listen to it. If you're at all into poetry, I would encourage you to pick it up. Discipline by Dash Shaw. Not necessarily the kind of stuff I like from Dash Shaw, but I thought this format was really interesting. I love the way he adapted these sort of Civil War Quaker letters into the style of his comic. The drawings don't really adhere to any sort of paneling system. He's very good at directing the eye across the page in a way that negates the need for a rigid panel structure. I wasn't excessively compelled by it, but I love Dash Shaw's style, and this was still a very good, very impressive piece of work. Horses Make a Landscape Look More Beautiful by Alice Walker. Anything I could say about this book wouldn't do it justice. Alice Walker is. The Emperor of Gladness by Ocean Vuong. Oh god, I have such a soft spot for Ocean Vuong. I've been talking recently to a friend about how some books just inexplicably have this compulsiveness to them. Relatively rare for me that like the page disappears in front of me when I'm reading and I forget that I'm reading a book. I'm so engrossed. The faults of a book kind of fall away and I'm just left with this incredible feeling that I got when I read it. This feeling of complete detachment from any real life burdens and a complete immersion into another world. And Ocean Vuong facilitates that for me effortlessly. The Emperor of Gladness is a 500+ page book and I read it in 2 days. I could not put it down. His use of metaphor, of symbols, of imagery is just intoxicating to me. The character called Sony because his parents wanted to name him after a totem of prosperity from the culture they were integrating into. Sony's obsession with the American Civil War because in his mind he conflates the South in Vietnam to the South of America, the Confederate South. This was always going to be like a pretty easy one to rate for me, but I just loved it. I thought this book was incredible. Oleana by David Mamet. Whew! Don't know what to say about this one. I think it's a very interesting, very fascinating landmark piece of theatre. I'm sure seeing this in person must be the kind of thing that I could not watch because I would be cringing so much at just watching these interactions unfold. You're torn between wanting to side with this character, understanding where this character's gone wrong. You're fascinated by the dynamics of power as the power shifts in this conversation like water in a glass that's being tipped from side to side. It's the power dynamic in this book sloshes. You're sort of horrified and fascinated and kind of outraged that David Mamet feels that he is allowed to tell this story. And that in itself is a fascinating discussion. I didn't rate this book when I read it, I still haven't, but I think about it pretty often and I'm glad I've read it so that I have that cultural touchstone. The Last Rainforests of Britain by Guy Shrubsole. I'm endlessly fascinated by the ecology of Britain. I'm always gonna have a soft spot and an interest in the work of people who are intending to contribute towards wilding projects. I've been to bits of temperate rainforest in the UK and I've always wanted to know more about them, so I'm very, very glad this book exists and that I have read it. The Penguin Book of Spiritual Verse, 110 Poets on the Divine by Kaveh Akbar. This is a collection compiled by Kaveh Akbar and he wrote the introduction, so of course I bought it. I really liked this collection. I thought the poets and poems selected were brilliant, but I do, and this is a pet peeve and I understand completely why it was organised the way it was organised. I wish it had been organised by theme rather than chronology, because I think seeing two poems on relatively similar topics written 1,000 years apart would be fascinating to see in a compendium of this size. But I also totally understand the practical reasons for organising it chronologically, and I don't begrudge anybody for that decision. Genderqueer, a Memoir by Maya Kobabe. I'm just in awe of how painfully honest this book was in the most wonderful way possible. The fact that this was written when it was written, not that this is a particularly old book, but like the stuff being discussed by this author in this book is radical and difficult for most audiences now. We're talking neo-pronouns, very intricate, difficult for the layman to pass, gender expression and dynamics. Essential reading, to be honest. Gideon the Ninth, Hara the Ninth, and Nona the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I read the first two a few years ago, and I finally got around to reading the third, but it felt necessary to get a refresher on the first two, and I listened to the audiobooks for these mainly. I have such a soft spot for the Gideon the Ninth series. I think the world building is fantastic. I think Tamsin Muir's storytelling is fantastic. Only Tamsin Muir could get away with books where you only understand what's happening across 600 pages in the last 50, and even then you don't really know what's going on. I think she is such a good storyteller. Only she could make me sit through books of this size and magnitude without getting pissed the fuck off at the fact that I don't know what's happening. The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. This is a good book, don't get me wrong, but so much of it is about baseball and maths, and I know nothing about either of those, and I have no intention of knowing anything about either of those. Not that that removes this book's capacity for an emotional connection. I was not as invested as I hoped I would be. You Weren't Meant to Be Human by Andrew Joseph White. Holy shit. That's all I gotta say. Holy shit. Keep Up Upon It by Chloe Michelle Howarth. Holy shit, but in a completely different way. Chloe Michelle Howarth's books, I don't necessarily remember the precise events of what happens, or even like a particular chronology, but I'm always left with such an intense sense of the book, such an immense sense of longing and yearning and emotional turmoil. And I mean that in the best way possible. She is just an incredible writer, and her prose is luminous. Love Me Tender by Constance de Bray. This is a very good book. Cements to me that Constance de Bray is a very good writer, but it is so miserable, so miserable. And I'm very interested in this character, but it was just a bit of a slog to read because I was so hoping that something good would happen, and then subsequently just generally disappointed. Pick a Colour by Suvankam Thamavongsa. I didn't connect hugely with this book, but I don't think the book is intending to make a really fierce emotional connection. This is just a slice of someone's life, a day in the life of a woman who owns a nail salon in, I believe, Canada. You get her ongoing thought process, the things she reflects on, the past she tries to ignore and deflect, the way she treats her employees, the way she treats her customers. You just get her running in a monologue through one day's work. A really beautiful, understated piece of literature that, despite me reading from start to finish and thinking that was pretty good and putting it down without any strong feelings, I do think about it a lot. I reflect on this book a lot, and I think about it through the context of the fact that the vast majority of people are living exceptionally ordinary lives and still have such rich inner lives and so much to say about so many things. All Fours by Miranda July. I read this for a book club, and I started out hating it. I was so stressed, but the resolution that comes after that quite extended and excruciating setup pays off so well that by the end of it I gave it a 4-star, and I was one of the only 2 people at this book club meeting to give it a rating above a 3. So it paid off in the end, and I am really, really interested in Miranda July as a writer and creative. Into the Wild by John Krakauer. Wow. Again, what can I say but wow? Sobering and humbling and strangely inspiring to read as someone who constantly aspires to run into the woods, and that is probably not a good thing. The Call of the Friend by Jae-hoon Choi. Wanted a lot more out of this than I got. Some of the horror illustrations in this are very good, but the narrative is very disjointed, and I thought I had a vague sense of what the author was trying to do, and then I read the author's notes at the end of the book and I thought, wow, I did not get that really at all. But the concept is so good. I really wanted it to be great, and I think that made its letdown worse. The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez. I didn't dislike this, and there were a couple of stories in this that I really, really liked, but there comes a point in a book where every single short story is about the misery and suffering of women and children. You hit a plateau and you're like, why the fuck am I reading this? This is past a certain point, it stopped feeling like we were having an interesting conversation about these things through a horror lens and more like it was just a showcase of a bunch of miserable shit. The appendix, Transmasculine Joy in a Transphobic Culture by Liam Kuhneman. I thought this was great. I really, really did. I thought it was a beautiful, condensed little manifesto about the importance of clinging to queer joy and enjoying existing as yourself as a radical act in a world that wishes you harm. Not nearly as joyful as the title would imply. It's pretty miserable and pretty difficult to read in parts, but that makes his message of the importance of joy all the more emphatic. Portrait of a Thief by Grace D. Lee. This was another book club book. I fucking hated this really bad. So poorly written, so poorly illustrated. All of these characters have the personality of wet wipes. I did have the fortune of going to a book club where a couple of the people there were Asian and had experience of moving to either the US or the UK, and they found value in the way that was portrayed, that difficult sort of in-between space where you're not entirely of one culture and you're not entirely of the other. So I'll give them credit for that, but the narrative of this book, the actual like heist plot was so stupid. You're telling me they got those bronze statues through TSA? Give me a fucking break. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. What a book! I really, really enjoyed this. I've listened to a couple podcasts since about what the fuck is going on in this book, and I think it's a fascinating illustration of the political moment that this was written in, and Bulgakov himself, and his use of allegory and imagery is just so full of joy, and I'm so fascinated by him. Meat for Burgers, Welcome to Burgatory by Beck Kubrick. My favourite part by far is where an inspector comes to this purgatory burger restaurant in order to get all the staff to pass the inspection. They are told that they need to immerse themselves in the company culture. And the company culture is literally a vat of kombucha. I really liked this. I hate calling stuff cute because it feels demeaning, but I love the art style. I love the way these characters are explored and depicted. I thought this was really fun. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad I own it. You Glow in the Dark by Liliana Kalanzi. There are two stories in this collection that were absolutely fantastic that I really, really liked. The rest of it fell a little bit flat for me, but I did overall enjoy it, and I wouldn't not recommend it, and it's short enough and the edition is beautiful enough that I wouldn't feel bad about making people buy it to read it, even if they didn't particularly enjoy it. The Pervert by Michelle Perez. This is a comic I've been meaning to read for ages, and I finally got round to it, and I'm so glad I did. Fantastic trans comic, so honest and raw and painful, in a way only trans comic art can be. DILF, Did I Leave Feminism by Jude Doyle. I have not shut up about this. I find reading feminist literature quite difficult because of the way it doesn't often take into account trans people and the liminal space between genders that all trans people inevitably occupy when we're talking about traditional gender roles and gender expectations, because these are people who are moving across that map. Just existing as a book was incredibly exciting to me, and I think Jude Doyle does such an incredible job of addressing the space that trans people occupy in conversations about feminism, and the fact that it's so ridiculous to ask a trans-masculine person who has been embroiled in feminist politics their entire life, oh, so are you gonna stop talking about feminism now? Just because they've transitioned, when feminism has always been for everyone. Bell Hooks wrote that book. Jackson Alone by Jose Ando. This book kinda sucks. But when you try and describe the plot, anybody with an even vaguely strange taste in literature is going to be like, that sounds awesome, because it does. Even the most absurd parts that happen towards the end of the book, it all sounds like it should be so good, and then none of it works on the page. It just all falls apart. There's no real driving force behind the narrative. It feels totally disjointed. I have no idea what the author was trying to really say on a larger scale with this book. It's like 120 pages long, and I read it in a single evening. So I'm not even mad about the time that I wasted investing into this, because I was so curious about where the hell it was going. And then it turns out it wasn't really going anywhere. I love it. I can't help but feel quite charmed and endeared. I'm interested in the topics being explored. I just thought the way they were explored was completely incomprehensible to me. Maybe I'm just stupid, I don't know. Local Fires by Joshua Jones. This is a series of short stories set in Llanelli in Wales, exploring the lives of queer people in various facets of their life in a town that has been very underinvested in and feels like a bit of a dead end to a lot of its inhabitants. I really liked this book. It reminded me a lot of the storytelling of Pick a Colour. It's little wedges of people's day-to-day lives. You get just a brief look into their internal monologues and their day-to-day experiences and the things they struggle with and the things that they take pleasure in. And I really liked it. The Last Children of Tokyo by Yoko Tawada. I love this book. I see this book get mixed reviews, and I totally do understand that people who want more world building would be disappointed by this, but I actually think the world building in this is ingenious. We're reading this dystopian future from the perspective of a man whose primary focus is perpetuating the life of his incredibly sickly grandson. His efforts are so concentrated that the world around him sort of phases in and out depending on whether he's spending time with his grandson, preparing him food, or he's out on a walk on his own. He's much more willing to explore the realities of the world when he's by himself, but when he's with his grandson, all other thoughts fall to the wayside and he's just concerned about the health of his grandson. That might be like a little bit of an exaggeration of the way it reads. When we hear about the world, it is through the lens of how the world is made more difficult for his grandson to live. We're drip-fed information about this world through a very, very human lens. There's no sit down, this is what happened, this is how the world works now. We get little shreds of information. We still don't get a full picture of what happened to lead them to the world being in the state that it's in at the present. We get just enough information to get a sense of what's going on, and I actually thought that was great. I really, really like this book. Without Merit by Colleen Hoover. Wow. I've never read any Colleen Hoover before. I knew this was gonna be bad. This is, and I mean this with kind of awe and admiration for how bad Colleen Hoover is at writing and how successful she's been. This is the worst book I've ever read, by like a long shot. I can't think of any other story that has perplexed and offended and outraged and infatuated me in the way that this book has. So uniquely, pointedly bad. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that Colleen Hoover as a person was completely fake, and she's actually Harper Lee got reincarnated and decided to shitpost for the rest of her career. That's how I feel about Colleen Hoover. Like, she must be good at writing in some capacity to be this bad at it. You know? You gotta know the rules to break them. I haven't stopped thinking about this, and like, what the fuck? She managed to work the Syrian refugee crisis into this one, and it's done so badly. You think, oh wow, that would be terrible. It is! Okay, last two here. Fuck me, it's been ages. Deacon King Kong by James McBride. Thank God we end on such a good note. This is a book with so much heart, so much presence, so much character. I was constantly forgetting the fact that I was reading a book. I actually didn't want this book to end so badly that I stopped reading anything for like a week. There was just a week where I didn't read anything because I knew I was gonna have to finish the last 60 pages of this book, and I wasn't ready for it to be over. An immediate favourite of the year. And the final book, it just felt like going from win to win, was Nova Scotia House by Charlie Porter. This feels like someone picked a bunch of my personal interests and thought, how do we work this into a plot narrative? Loved this book and the way it discussed community and subversion and counterculturalism in as radical and honest a way as it could. We follow a character who is years after the ending of a very formative relationship, constantly reflecting on this relationship, living in a flat that he was in this relationship in. Jerry, his partner, taught him to be self-sufficient, taught him to live out of a garden that he grew. And we meet the protagonist, Johnny, as a tower block is being built across from his apartment block that is going to block out all of his natural light. His way of life is about to end, and we meet him at this pivotal moment. He's looking constantly to the past, constantly to the future. It's just a beautiful, beautiful piece of storytelling, and I'm so glad I've read it. And it was another easy 5 stars. And that was it. That was everything. That was 111. Wow, my throat hurts. I haven't talked that much in one go for a while. It's been a really strong reading year, especially looking back through that list. I feel like I'm getting more of a sense of what I like. I'm getting much more trigger happy with DNFs, which I know some people aren't crazy about, but really works for me. If I can tell I'm not gonna like something within 20 pages because of the writing style, I'm quite picky about prose, I just drop it. I just don't read it, because probably what is going to happen is I'm going to find it's not actually as bad as I was expecting it to be, but it still wasn't great, and I still didn't really enjoy it, and I'm going to end up feeling quite a lot more animosity towards the book than if I had simply accepted that it wasn't particularly for me and moved on to something else. I've been thinking about reading goals a lot. I don't usually set parameters for myself. I used to do the Goodreads reading challenge, but then I just found it so fucking stressful, and what I ended up doing was crunching in the last 3 months of the year to reach that goal, reaching it and then burning out and then not reading anything else for like 2 months. Now that I'm not focusing on goals at all, I set it at 50 this year, knowing that I was going to read a shit ton of comics and blast that goal out of the water pretty easily. As a result, I've not been focused about the actual like material rate of reading. I'm not perfect with it for sure. I still feel like I'm stagnating if I spend too long on one book, but I feel like I've been getting marginally better with that as well. I've been thinking of setting goals this year just because I have a bit more free time than I used to do. There are a lot of authors that I really want to get around to that I think without sitting down and saying, okay, I need to read this person this year, I'm not going to get around to. So that might be a video in the future. Anyway. Bye.